Greg Buttermore, and I'm the Director of Marketing for the Auburn-Cord-Duesenberg Museum. Well, the Duesenberg brothers came to America as little kids. They were part of a big family, and they emigrated from Lippe, Germany, and they came to Iowa, of all places. They settled in the country outside of Rockford, Iowa, and they had a farm life growing up. And I think in that early era of emerging farm mechanisms, they really had inspired in them a curiosity for all things mechanical, especially the things you could work on yourself with your own hands. In the late 1800s, in that late 19th century period, you had this shift from agrarian U.S. to more populated, more urban. And this brought about a lot of factories, corporations that were making sophisticated farm equipment. And a lot of it was being developed in that turn of the century period, and the Duesenberg brothers both would have been exposed to it. These two brothers, Frederick was the elder. He was 7 years old when they came to the U.S., and August, who was always known as Augie fondly, was only 4 years old when they came. And I think they came to this country in a period in the late 19th century when farming was becoming a lot more sophisticated. Agrarian America was dying out, and urban America was growing up. And so they saw this emerging farm technology right at home all the time. And that sparked in them this natural curiosity to see how mechanical things work and to get their hands on it, because they were very hands-on kinds of guys. And you would have to describe both brothers as native talents, in that they had an innate aptitude for working on mechanical things and a curiosity about mechanisms. And that was all inspired right on the farm at home. Well, one of Fred's earliest jobs was right in Rockford, Iowa, working for a windmill company repairing windmills. And that was a clear indication that he was going down this avenue of working on mechanisms that could harness energy, capture energy, and convert it into motion. And when you think about it, that's what the whole balance of his illustrious career was based on. Well, Fred just had a real inclination to gravitate towards speed and racing and motion, and this capturing of energy and converting it into motion. And bicycles were the perfect starting point for that. It was a cheap, easy way to get involved with racing and with motion and with mechanical things that you could get your hands on and tweak and improve yourself without having to have a lot of tools and a lot of capital to get started doing it. So he was involved with bicycles as a very young fellow.
And in that era, bicycle racing was like just becoming really big.
Yeah, I don't think people would realize today how big bicycle racing was at one time. It was there was a rage, a fad for it, and it was a big sport for young adults and for kids both at that time.
And Fred was attracted.
In fact, both brothers were. Fred and Augie both were.
Okay. The inspiration for racing bicycles, Michael says here that it wasn't only to win, but to advance his understanding of engineering and design things that were faster. Can you explain a little bit about maybe what was going on with him at that moment?
Well, I think one of the reasons he wanted to race bicycles was to make money, because you could make money in bicycle racing winning the first prize, which he did over and over. And then he would apply that money towards the experimentation that would lead to the building of better bicycles later on, which he needed to do because his goal was to open a bicycle shop of his own, which he did in Rockford a short time after that. And it just fed this whole need to constantly have your hands on something mechanical, something where power is driven from one place to another, and the speed and motion obsession, which both of these boys had as kids, and they just couldn't get it out of their system.
How did the bicycle shop fare?
As far as I know, the bicycle shop that they had in Rockford did moderately well at first, and then it ran onto hard times. This would have been in the very early part of the century. And when Fred was about 26 years old, it did go into bankruptcy. And nobody's quite clear all the reasons why. But Fred was a, pull yourself up by the bootstraps type. And actually, he opened another bicycle shop a very short time after that and kept going.
Is there anything to the, I'm not sure, but is there anything to the assumption that maybe he was a little bit better mechanic than he was a business person?
Oh, definitely. Both Duesenberg brothers never wanted to portray themselves as business minds, or after they were successful in the auto industry, they never wanted to be officers and never tried to pawn themselves off as auto executives. They were anything but that. They were mechanics, and they developed into fine engineers, and that's how they build themselves, and that's how they wanted other people to build them. And they were unpretentious, and they never wanted to be anything else. And they made sure they were never ascended to presidency of any company that they ever ran. They were mechanics and engineers.
So they'd much rather get the grease under their fingers.
Always. And even in Augie's later years, when he was an employee at Auburn Automobile Company in the 1930s, he'd come to work dressed, allegedly as an executive in the company, in his three-piece wool suit. And in no time, he'd be on the ground underneath the car, writhing around in the oil just to get his hands on something. Neither brother could really outgrow that kind of thing. I think that all their activities with bicycles led very naturally to cars. They were experimenting with little engines to put on their bicycles to make motorbikes and early versions of motorcycles. And it was just a natural progression to lead to cars. And they were born in a period in the late 1870s that was very lucky timing, because by the time they reached early adulthood, that was the formative era, the pioneering era, as we call it, of the auto industry. So they were ripe and ready for it when it came. Well, winning a race must have been a major thrill for Fred, who went to Mason City, Iowa, which is where they had a big racetrack, and won his first race. And he won, of all things, a car called the Marion, which is kind of an obscure make of car. And just coincidentally, as foreshadowing, the Marion was an Indiana-built car that was built in Indianapolis, which is where the Duesenberg brothers would find their fame and fortune later on. The Duesenberg brothers were great entrepreneurs without having to become auto executives ever. They just stayed as engineers and mechanics. And the jobs they took were always along those lines. Now, Augie, totally independent on his own, formed his own company. It was called the Duesie Gasoline Engine Works in the little town of Garner, Iowa. And this allowed him to be both a dealer and a manufacturer, because he could be a bicycle and auto dealer on one hand, and then simultaneously he could be an engine builder, which really fulfilled him. And at the same time, Fred was going off on his own, working for the Jeffrey Auto Company. And the way that came about was through an earlier period when Fred had his bicycle shop. He carried many lines and many brands of bicycles. And one of the bikes he carried was the Rambler, which, when you think about it, is a pretty clever name for a bicycle back in that early era. And the company that built the Rambler bicycle eventually evolved into building cars that were also called the Rambler. And this company was run by Charles Jeffrey. And so Fred, by being a major Rambler bicycle dealer, met Charles Jeffrey. And Jeffrey then moved his company to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and started making his own car named after himself, called the Jeffrey. And that's the company that Fred went to work for to get more auto experience. I think the Duesenberg brothers were always close. They were 3 years different in age. They admired and respected each other so much. They were very similar in personality type. I think Fred was more of a leader, more of a dominating, aggressive go-getter type. And probably Augie was quieter and more modest, but they were very similar in many ways. And I think they were almost destined to work together, because their mechanical minds, their goals in life, their capacity to work together was so smooth. It was almost meant to be. As often as there were brothers and families who worked together harmoniously in the auto industry, there were just as many who fought and bickered and wouldn't speak to each other, and their companies, their auto companies that they capitalized, would dissolve, and that would be the end of it. But the Duesenbergs really worked smoothly together. They really didn't start racing until Fred decided to get involved with the Mason automobiles. That's how they really got started in a prolific way with racing. And Fred Maytag, who was famous as the washing machine king, was the owner of an auto company that made the Mason car, and that was in Waterloo, Iowa. And at first, the Duesenbergs were racing Mason stock cars as they came out of the factory. And then, of course, they couldn't resist tweaking and improving those, souping up the engines, modifying them to make them race better. This eventually led to building hybrid cars that were Masons with purely Duesenberg engines in them. And what kind of opened a door was the fact that Fred Maytag just pulled out of the company and didn't have any interest in it. And I think that made the Mason cars more accessible for Fred to get a hold of and to modify and change. And they had great success with these Mason cars. So that eventually led to them building their own cars. And 1913 was about the first period they were making Duesenberg cars. It was purely a Duesenberg product. By the next year, by 1914, they were ready to enter cars in the Indianapolis 500, which was just a 3-year-old race at that time. And they were able to scramble around and get 2 cars ready. And these were 4-cylinder cars, which was kind of the order of the day then. And they were certainly dialed up. They were red, white, and blue with the American flag on the side. And they entered these 2 Duesenberg cars, and Willie Haupt drove one of them, and Eddie Rickenbacker drove the other one, who was soon to become very famous as a World War I flying ace. And they came in 10th place and 12th place, which was a fair showing. They did well in that they finished the race. They actually both cars went all 200 laps of the race. And the majority of cars at the Indy 500 back then didn't finish all 200 laps. So they were successful in that way. But they didn't place any better than 10th and 12th place because, frankly, it was the European cars, the Peugeot and the Delage, that were doing better in the Indy 500 at that time.
Did this, though, establish them as racing contenders, or were they just kind of...
I wouldn't say, by the time the Indianapolis 500 came along, they weren't merely dabbling. They were really in the racing game in a big way. Finally, by 1914, they had a car out there that had the Duesenberg emblem on it. I mean, their trademark name was on that car. That was their own car. That was a major milestone for them. Imagine having your own car out there that is having racing success. And they didn't just have success on the brick track at Indianapolis. They were racing quite a lot on board tracks. This was an era when the all hardwood racetracks all around the country were very popular, and more Duesenbergs were raced on wood tracks than dirt or brick tracks. And there were board tracks in Altoona and Atlantic City and Sheepshead Bay out on Long Island, and lots of them in California and Beverly Hills. And Duesenbergs performed very well year after year on those board tracks. So they were really getting their name entrenched as race car designers and engineers and team managers. And finally, they had that Duesenberg name right on the nose of the car. That was a big turning point.
Was this somewhat of a balancing act they had to play between being racers and designers?
It was. I would say sometimes the racing activity would dominate. I would say that except for the 2 years when America was involved in World War I, the teens were heavily involved with racing and establishing their name and doing well, winning races. Once they were building passenger cars, which really wasn't until 1921, in the early 20s it was the passenger car activity that was dominating, even though they still raced quite a lot. And it was always a balancing act to see which one was doing better. But no matter which fortunes were doing better and which activity was taking up the most time, Fred was always still developing new engines and better engines for aviation, for marine, and for automobile use.
Now, since you mentioned the aviation, they have this huge contract in World War I. Is that kind of what gave them the freedom to pursue this race bug that they had?
It's funny how major wars like world wars always spur on the economy, and that was true for the Duesenberg brothers. They got through World War I by doing their patriotic duty and just doing marine and aviation engine building. And what they really made money on and kept busy with was a contract to build huge, huge V16 Bugatti aviation engines. And they built a huge number of those in a brand new plant that they built in 1917 in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And ironically, this new factory was not built with any motorized vehicles. The factory was built with just horses and wagons bringing the materials there. The construction industry didn't have heavy-duty trucks yet, so the motor industry didn't help on the building of that plant. And they had their flag waving, like all the other companies did during the war. They had a very noisy magazine ad campaign about, how we're just building engines for airplanes and ships to get through the war. And they made a lot of money during that period, enough that when the war was over, they could embark on this idea of building passenger cars.
Okay. Was there ever any question about these two as German immigrants? Not too long. Well, when did they immigrate? It was in the 1880s?
They came here in 1884.
Okay,
So
they've been around.
the one brother was born at the end of 1876, the other at the end of 1879. So they were just still young kids when they came.
Obviously, they got to give them a contract, so there wasn't too much of a problem with that.
No, I don't think, there was always the confusion with people thinking that the Duesenberg was a British, or rather, the Duesenberg was a German-made car. But other than that, I don't know that they ran into prejudice or bigotry by having a Germanic name. Fred's name had been Friedrich when he came here, and he changed it to Frederick on his signature. August didn't change his name at all. I don't know that they had troubles during the war along those lines.
Okay. How did they wind up in Indiana then? Was it largely because of the racetrack at Indianapolis?
Indianapolis Motor Speedway was what brought them, lured them to Indiana. And I'm sure it was almost like a destiny because their spiritual home ended up being there. It was almost inevitable for them to come to Indiana because that's where the top racetrack was. And they were so deeply invested in racing, how could it not have happened that they would come to Indiana?
I guess it's hard to really get a sense of what the Indy 500 even meant back in those days. You know? But, so they're racing, they're still pursuing the passenger car manufacturing in a pretty big way. Is this one of the reasons why the Model A was such an advanced car? Can you talk about advanced cars?
The Duesenbergs didn't embark on any passenger car building until 1921. So it was after they left Elizabeth, New Jersey, and the war was over, and some auto executives helped them set up a new corporation that was no longer called just Duesenberg Motors Corporation. It was called Duesenberg Automobile and Motors Corporation. And they built a new plant on West Washington Street, downtown in Indianapolis, in 1920, in time to start building cars for the 1921 season. And their first car was a very expensive luxury car, which did fairly well for them. It became known later as the Model A, and it put them in a league with other cars that were out on the market in the late 20s, Stutz and Marmon and Locomobile, in that kind of price range, about a $6,500 price range. And it also put their name out there in a whole new dominion. They had only been known previously for building aviation and marine engines, disembodied engines, and racing cars. This was the first time they were ever making a luxury passenger car of any kind.
And was it really technologically advanced for its day, or was it...
The innovations that were really important on the Duesenberg Model A were the fact that it had four, well, I'll start over. The innovations that were really important on the Duesenberg Model A were the fact that it had hydraulic brakes on all 4 points, which no car had ever had before, and that came out in 1921. It was a custom-bodied car, and that was still kind of uncommon in that period. Duesenberg made the chassis and the engine and the sheet metal forward of the cowl. But the main thing was it had a straight 8 engine. And by straight 8, that means the cylinder arrangement, the inline straight 8 engine. And it was a single overhead camshaft, and that had never been used with a straight 8 before. To my knowledge, all the overhead valve engines on the market in the early 20s were littler. They were 4-cylinder and 6-cylinder cars. So to have that configuration of straight 8 was a novel idea.
They won at Le Mans, and that was pretty significant for an American team to beat the cream of the crop of the Europeans in their own game. Tell me what that was like, the frantic preparations, the race.
By the summer of 1921, they were ready to enter Duesenberg cars in the Great Grand Prix in Le Mans in France. And no American mark of car had ever won that race before. So they didn't enter just one car, they entered a fleet of Duesenbergs, and they took all their best drivers over to France. And their star driver that year was Jimmy Murphy. And during one of the test practice drives in a Duesenberg, he was in a wreck, and it wrecked the car, and he was badly injured. And he refused any treatment or a trip to the hospital. He just said, tape me up, patch me up, put me back in the race. So he drove the race kind of under duress, injured. And he came to victory in a Duesenberg car at the Grand Prix. That was the first time an American car had won that race. And what was difficult about the win was that The cars that were dominating at the Grand Prix at that time were French-built cars, especially the Ballot. And there was one Ballot driven by Ralph DePalma, who had his nephew, Peter DePaulo, as his mechanic in the car. And it was a neck-and-neck finish for the Duesenberg to win over the Ballot. And the French were so upset. They were very snooty about this win because, you know, to think of the effrontery of the upstart Americans coming over and taking over their race and taking their victory away from them, it was very unsettling for them. And at the awards dinner after the race, they were snubbed because the Europeans were very upset that the Americans won. But that was a great turning point. That was the first time that Duesenberg could say, we can market our company strongly now off of a great racing heritage, a very rich racing heritage. And they adopted this slogan, out of the crucible of racing comes the Duesenberg passenger car. And they used their racing heritage to market their passenger cars forevermore after that. So that was a milestone for them, that win.
It must have really been something. I just can't imagine, you know, how we would react today if something like that happened. The racing effort really wasn't profitable, though, was it? Why do it if you couldn't make any money?
Well, the idea of racing back in that era when racing was so big was to just get your name out there, establish your name. It was prestige. I don't think anybody could make money in racing. I mean, look at the overhead you had. You had a fleet of cars. You were always wrecking cars and had to repair them and replace them. You had teams of drivers who would come and go, and teams of mechanics, and you had to transport these cars all over Kingdom Come from one venue to another, constantly in all kinds of weather. I don't see how anybody could have made money in racing. I think that was a break-even proposition at best. So the idea was to establish your name in racing and then exploit that to the hilt in your passenger car building, which a lot of companies did, and Duesenberg did it more than anybody else.
But I guess the passenger side of the car, passenger car side of the business was kind of in trouble at the same time. I mean, they were spending all this money on racing, and they, even though they were popular, I guess they weren't making much money in the passenger car operation. If
you were on the west side of Indianapolis in the 20s, you would have seen this bright gleaming new plant on the corner of Washington and Harding Street, where all the passenger cars by the name of Duesenberg were made. And right across the street was where all the racing cars were made. So these two activities were going on across the street from one another. And the racing cars were even made up on a second floor level that didn't have an elevator, so they just had to wrestle the cars up and down a ramp to get them in and out. So these activities were going on in the face of each other on Washington Street. And nobody knew if, you know, one activity would win out or not. But I think what happened is that Duesenberg passenger car activity began to falter because you had this very expensive $6,500 price car entering the marketplace at a time when America suffered from a deep recession. Most people tend to characterize the 20s as all boom years, and they forget that in the early 20s, in the winter season of 1921 and 22, there was a very serious recession that took America a long time to recover from. And that's when the Model A Duesenberg was trying to make its place and set its image on the marketplace. So they had trouble there. Also, I think the Duesenberg company suffered from the fact that it had these two figureheads who were just mechanics and engineers, really, and didn't want to be auto executives. So they had to find other people to be the auto executives, and they were often weak, shyster, or ineffectual people who would come and go. In fact, one president they just had to ostracize who was doing such a poor job.
Were there some that were really